Hey you all, Farmer Jesse here. I have a little bit of a treat for you. The Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario hosted a conference, a virtual conference back in the beginning of December, and I moderated two different events. Now, one is on large-scale no-till vegetable production, and the other is on small-scale no-till vegetable production. And so I'm going to share both of those. Today, I'm going to share the large-scale no-till vegetable production talk featuring Dan Oostenbrink, who's been on Growers Live and the No-Till Market Garden podcast. Also, Ken Lang and Théo Germain Trudeau. So in this conversation, we just talk about their systems on a larger scale. And so big thanks to the EFAO for lending us this video. And I'm going to put it up on the podcast as well. Tomorrow, I'm going to do the small scale version. This video is brought to you in part by a grant from Southern SARE. One note, my video and audio is kind of choppy, and I don't know why, but I don't talk that much. And everybody else sounds awesome. So let's do it.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to let everyone join the meeting and begin in a minute. This morning's session is no-till vegetable farming for large-scale systems. Okay, as we were a few minutes late, I will begin. Dylan, you'll be admitting folks in if anyone's lagging. Wonderful.
Yep.
Okay. Good morning on the last day of the EFAO conference. Before we begin, I'd like to let everyone know that we are recording this session. My name is Sarah, and I'm the research director with EFAO, and co-hosting this morning is Dylan. Dylan, you want to give a wave? Yeah, wonderful. And to start things off, I'd like to say our land acknowledgement. And today I will be giving an acknowledgement that places me as the host where I am. Today I'm speaking from land that's surrounded by the gift of life from water. That's a Great Lake and creeks and rivers like the Antler River, also known as the Thames River. And these lands with these incredible bodies of water are the traditional and current lands of the Anishinaabe, most currently the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, the Haudenosaunee, most currently Oneida Nation of the Thames, and the Lenape, most currently Munsee Delaware Nation. These lands are protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum of 1701 between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and are covered under the McPhee Purchase as part of Treaty 2. Land acknowledgements are just the very start of the process of reconciliation. To continue this most essential work, I invite us all to take a moment and reflect on the land where we each currently stand and consider questions like the ones on the screen. We also encourage you to learn the history of the land you are in relationship with by visiting whos.land and native-land.ca, and Dylan will dump those links into the chat. And you're invited to read EFAO's land acknowledgement and learn about what actions EFAO is taking in terms of anti-racism, equity, and reconciliation at the following websites that will also be in the chat. And please reach out if you have any thoughts or feedback for EFAO. The EFAO staff and board are very interested in learning together and taking concrete actions. We'd like to thank our conference sponsors, this incredible slide of companies and organizations that have supported us. I think I skipped, yes, I did. I'm gonna just go back here. I clicked too fast. I'd like to first thank our conference supporting partners. We are very grateful for the support of these inspiring organizations who are contributing to the conference sessions and who have also helped promote the conference through their networks. And these organizations include the Canadian Organic Growers, Regeneration Canada, the Carrot Cash, Local Food and Farm Co-ops Network, the National Farmers Union Ontario, the Ontario Soils Network, the Organic Council of Ontario, the Fair Finance Fund, and the Bauta Family Initiative on Canadian Seed Security. And then thank you also to all of our conference sponsors who've provided financial support for this year's conference, as well as contributing towards conference bursaries. Without their contribution, this conference would not be possible. There have been opportunities to meet and chat with the sponsors, as well as our partner organizations listed on the previous slide during the lunch and social hours on the Wonder platform that we're using, and there will be continued opportunity to interact with sponsors at the last few Wonder sessions of the day. So please check the conference website to see when particular sponsors will be on Wonder. I would also like to thank the following foundations for their generous and continued support of EFAO. These foundations are not only supporting this year's conference, but also support EFAO's ongoing programs and operations and are essential to our work. The Brian and Joanna Lawson Family Foundation, the West End Family Foundation, the T.R. Megan Family Foundation, and the Robert and Moira Sansom Ideas Foundation, a project within the London Community Foundation. And I'm sure everyone is well aware of how to engage, but just some reminders: turn on your video if you'd like, change your display name to reflect how you'd like to be referred to, and you can use pronouns if you'd like. Introduce yourself in the chat. I see there are 58 of us here, so please tell us where you're coming from. And you can use the chat feature. And when it comes to Q&A, you can also raise your hand and then unmute yourself and ask a question using audio, which is lovely. If you have any questions, you can send a chat to me or Dylan during the session as well. One of the strengths of the EFAO community, and the feedback that we hear time and time again, is how incredible it is that speakers are so open and honest with their stories and the ins and outs of their farms. We hear how impactful this honest and open sharing is in creating resilient ecological farms, farmers, and a powerful movement. When we are gathering for farmer-led education, research, and community building, we are creating a culture together that is alive and dynamic. At all EFAO events, we cultivate a learning-oriented community and share and culture that is kind, patient, respectful, open, curious, and inclusive. And here we have an outline of the community agreements that we've come up with for this conference, and we've also posted them on the website. I won't read them all out, but you can see here are our thoughts for how we can work together to be kind, patient, respectful, open, and curious. Oh, sorry, I'm over-clicking here. There we go. So with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Jesse, who will introduce himself and the rest of the panelists, and we'll get started on this morning's large-scale mechanized systems for no-till farming. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you to the EFAO and Dylan and everybody that's been involved. Cassie, you all have put on such a great conference here. So welcome to everyone. I'm super excited to be doing this session on large scale no-till. I'll be your moderator today. My name is Jesse. I am the host of the No-Till Market Garden podcast. That's maybe where my voice is familiar. I co-own and run Rough Draft Farmstead with my wife, Hannah. I'm also co-founder of NoTillGrowers.com with my partner, Jackson Roulette, where we create various forms of media from audio podcasts to video, etc. I'm also the author of the Living Soil Handbook, and I am very excited to be doing this today. So, but before we dive into the nerdy stuff, I want to take a moment to introduce our panel of amazing farmers. First, I'm excited to introduce Dan Ostenbrink. He, along with his wife, Helen, practice no-till regenerative agriculture on a 25-acre parcel of land in the fertile Fraser Valley of BC, British Columbia. They grow a wide range of vegetables, fruits, herbs, flowers, and nuts, and sell their produce in an on-farm market. They also run a composting facility, Terra Flora Soil Works, specializing in fungal dominant worm castings that are produced for on-farm use and for neighboring farms and gardens. Education has been a pivotal component of their farm business, focusing on farm tours and an online gardening course. Welcome, Dan. Great to have you.
I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited to learn from Ken and Theo as well, and yourself.
And we're excited to have you. So next we have Ken Lang of Orchard Hill Farm. Ken graduated from the University of Guelph with a BSc in horticulture in 1979. He is farming at Orchard Hill Farm near St. Thomas, Ontario, with his wife Martha and daughter Ellen. Ken has experience growing in a wide variety of horticultural and field crops organically for 3 decades. Orchard Hill Farm is now the horticultural site for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's EFAO's Living Labs project in Ontario, which is looking to develop no-till strategies for organic vegetables for mid-scale market gardeners. And we're going to hear about this Living Labs here in a little bit. His experience with a wide variety of cover crops and years of building and modifying machinery are proving very useful. So welcome, Ken.
Great to be here. Great group.
And then we have Theo Germain Trudeau of La Clé de Sol. Theo is a young farmer based in Quebec. During his 3 years studying organic market gardening, he became deeply passionate about cover crops, and this path led him to the no-till movement, and that was exploding in France. After a 3-month internship and visits to Europe, he was sold on Living Soils, and after working on and managing different farms between 2018 and 2020, he wrote a small booklet about his experiences and the potential for the no-till movement in Quebec. In 2021, he started his farm, Le Clé de Sol, on a land trust 45 minutes east of Quebec City. The goal of his farm is to develop living soil solutions for commercial vegetable production and to recruit new farmers for the land trust. He is currently working with another farm on the same land trust that is working on the same approach, but on a larger scale, Vallée des Prairies. Theo is very knowledgeable about other no-till farms in Quebec and closely follows the movement in France. Welcome, Theo.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here to exchange about our common passion.
Absolutely. And then we also have Isabelle Spence-Legault, who's going to be helping in case Theo has any questions that need a little translation. So real quick, I'm going to ask questions of Dan and Theo to begin this session. Ken has a really exciting 10-minute presentation that I referenced a second ago to give on the Living Labs project. They have investigated a wide variety of no-till techniques with about 8 different vegetable crops, looking for promising methods. So in a bit, Ken will offer a report on 3 of the most feasible. Very excited about that. So let's get this thing rolling. I'm interested to hear how each of you generally describes your no-till regenerative system. But before you do, because context is everything in farming, maybe start by giving a brief description of the kind of acreage you're working with, maybe even soil type if it's relevant, heavy clay, heavy sand, etc. And then give us a general overview of the methods you use to manage your acreage. Maybe Dan, if you want to start that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so 25 acres, heavy clay. That summarizes our story. It's a large plot, and I want you to really get your mind around the size of 25 acres. It's absolutely massive, but you also need to remember that a person could be farming a large chunk of land but not farming it particularly well, and a person could be farming a small piece of land, farming it extraordinarily well. It's all about maximizing the production on that particular piece of land well, without any compromise to soil fertility and the ecosystem. So I would say on the 25 acres, I'm guaranteed there's probably farmers in our area who could be doing on that same size of land or being able to produce as much on 25 acres on 10 acres as we are on 25. Okay, so we've got a long ways to go in terms of getting our production up. That said, we are farming a large piece of land because it gives us more time in between crops to introduce animals, introduce cover crops, and the like. So what we do so our farm was originally a dairy farm, grass and corn for years and years. When we want to bring a new piece of land into production, we use a repeated summer tillage. The attempt is to rid the land of particularly of perennial weeds, dandelions, buttercup, horsetail, and the like. So especially the pernicious, the perennial weeds that we absolutely want to get rid of. We do a summer tillage. That means we're tilling every couple of weeks in order to stifle weeds and reduce the weed seed bank. By the fall, we like to apply 3 to 5 inches of compost. So if we're bringing in 2-3 acres of new land into our production system, you can understand that takes copious amounts of compost. And I think that, I'll talk about this later, that's one of our big challenges, is how do we get that compost onto the land? Right now we often bring in custom workers in order to just get that bulk on there. What we try to follow that with is if we can get the mulch on by fall, we can actually plant a really late cover crop here into October and November. That will usually be fava beans or peas or something that's easily removable. We are not very good at taking out rye and barley and oats. Most things over winter in our area, we don't get particularly cold winters like you do out east. These crops then are removed with a flail mower in the spring, which is, fits the width of our bed. We're working with a 30-40 inch bed. Our tractor to tractor spacing is about 60 inches, so 5 feet in between tires. And then we try to work within that in about a 30-inch bed, which means our pathways end up being about 30 inches or a little more. It just gives us lots of flexibility. We can go in there with larger tractor tires so that we don't have as much compaction. Our first crops in the following spring are usually potatoes. These often are just simply dug in a low furrow. And then usually at that time, that's when we remove the cover crop by applying more compost. So it's a lot of compost going on throughout the year. And then we use a drop spreader that's been adapted from what the turf guys use for application of sand in their fields. So we just modified a spreader. It takes about 3 to 4 yards, and it takes a long time, obviously, to cover 1 to 2 acres. So potatoes or squash, those are usually the preferred crops to go in the following year. Potatoes do particularly well, squash maybe not so well, but I'm never really banking on a massive crop. The expectation is that we're going to get mediocre results in our first year. And then forever after, we try to maintain weed-free beds. And that's, our farm is fairly clean. This year we were short on labor and we got a little bit behind. Our way to usually deal with that, again, is with an application of more compost. And so I think that pretty much summarizes or illustrates some of our large challenges. And then forever after, weed-free if possible. After the potatoes come out sometime in early June, we go in with our standard crops. And so potatoes are fairly easy to dig up in a light, loose mulch. We try to level the beds again, and there's a fair amount of soil disturbance that happens with potato production, which is something that we struggle with and are not fully able to come to grips with at this time. So we'll go in with a crop of, say, greens or carrots or beets or something like that will take us through the main season. And those crops then are terminated with a flail mower that we've modified. We bring that flail mower way down cutting into the top half inch of soil, and then crops are replanted after that. So I think that gives you a quick summary of where we're at, and I can talk about where we're going, but I'll wait for your cue on that. Yeah,
that's excellent, Dan. I have a lot of questions, and I'm sure other people do about certain things that you could really dive into. First, let's hear a little bit from Teo. Give us a little idea of your context, Teo, and maybe give us an overall sort of description of your sort of no-till approach.
Yeah, sure. So it's my first year this year farming with no-till techniques, and so I don't have a lot of long-term conclusions or technique answers to long-term problems that I had. But my main focus with this farm was to experiment no-till techniques in a specific context, because I was always reading, watching videos, visiting farms in Europe, and at this point I needed to try my own farm to try and make mistakes in this sense. So the system I was trying to build was with permanent beds, and I was developing two different systems. So there's one with permanent beds that are 100 foot long for more intensive crops like field tomatoes or cucumbers, summer squash, some brassicas. And then I was also developing another system with no permanent beds that's going to be flatter, well, just flat, for crops like winter squash or root vegetables, and to try to maximize the vegetable coverage. So no more alleys, just like big blocks of vegetables. Because in my situation, I have all the land I can imagine, so I can really develop fertility on the long term. And some fields are really far away from the buildings, so I'm building lower input fields, and higher input fields will be closer to the buildings. So I'm using the cover crops to build fertility. And after a first cover crop, well, this year was winter rye on all of my 100-foot bed long. So it was all about managing the winter rye without disturbing the soil, well, on almost every crop. So I used silage tarp, I used chop and drop, I used rolling, I used occultation, solarizing, and also when the cover crop was terminated, I was also adding mulch to be sure there were no weeds. But I also tested with just winter rye coverage to see how weeds would germinate and grow. So this year was just trying all those techniques and have a good production for the CSA baskets we're doing, because I'm working with the other farm, Vallée des Prairies, and so I'm renting tractors, and I'm renting the buildings, and I'm renting the land. So all of those factors were helping me to have a more experimental farm this year, because I didn't have a big investment, big cash invested in the farm, so I could just focus more on experimenting. And it was, for most of it, it was a success for most of the crops. And well, the yields were, you know, compared to other farms I saw, were the same or better, or sometimes a bit less, but just a normal production, even with those techniques that are not common in the region. So yeah, this is basically my system. So I'm working more with plants and fresh organic matter that's not composted, because compost is really expensive, and around here we don't get it for free. There's no cities that are just dumping it. So I'm using for nitrogen needs, for some crops I'm using more manure from chickens, and so that's the the basic of it. So it's all over the place.
No, that's great, Theo. I'm curious, kind of my next question was going to be about detailing specific no-till methods that you're using and that you're trialing. And one of the things you mentioned in there was that you were using different methods to sort of see what was working for your cover crop termination. Was there anything that really stood out there? You talked about the chop and drop, you talked about using silage tarps. Was there anything stood out there that you felt like that was a better method for your context, whether it was mowing it and dropping it and planting into that? Was there anything that stood out there that you feel like would be worth sharing?
Well, for me, like everything, almost everything worked okay. And the silage tarp, I knew that it was gonna work because it just you put the silage tarp, it's gonna terminate the cover crop, and you can plant tomatoes in it, and it's gonna work. So for me, the big surprises were more about solarizing and chop and drop, because it was the two techniques that I never used or never really saw on a farm. So solarizing was really interesting for me because in our region, it's really important to have heat in your soil early in the spring. And it was a good way to terminate the winter rye earlier than the flowering stage. And also it was heating the soil for example, for my first cucumbers, it was great because the soil was warmer. And also it did kill the gray worm. So I don't know the gray worm, if it's a common name. Maybe Isabelle can tell me if it's the good word. But so it's a worm that's in the soil that's gonna cut your vegetable plants. Gray worm, and then cutworm. So that's the cutworm. So it's really common when you're planting winter rye, because winter rye and all cereals will attract the cutworm. So by solarizing, I was able to kill the cutworm, and I saw I was testing different techniques side by side, and I saw a big difference when I was using the solarizing technique. So this was really interesting for me. And also just the chop and drop was really interesting because it's so simple. And when you're looking at your field and you're saying, I just grew a plant, chopped, planted, and then there's some weeds, but it's not a big mess. And I can harvest vegetable with a really low input system. So this was really interesting for me. It's not magic. You still get dandelion and some weeds that are more pesky, but you can, after that, use the tarp to mitigate this problem on a more long term, or manual weeding, but that's not the best case scenario. So those are the two, for me, that were the most interesting. And the use of mulch, added mulch, leaves or hay or straw was just there's just no weeds that can compete with the vegetable. So that's perfect, but you're putting more work in it. And in the beginning of my systems, since it's not living soil for now, the mulch made by the winter rye didn't decompose really fast because there's not a lot of biology. But so when I was adding mulch, it was maybe just too much. It's gonna jam and not breathe enough or something like this. So yeah, those are the two main techniques that I used. That was really surprised. But silage tarp and planting in silage tarp is just easy, and you can put it where it's your worst spot, where there's tons of perennial weeds. And for some of the crops I'm doing, I'm gonna use it anyway if I'm tilling or not tilling. So it's just a good way to take care of the more perennial weeds.
Yeah, that's great. The a couple things that you do that resonated with me is I also use cover crops on on my more distant plots, the ones that are not close to my wash pack station, and then have the more intensive crops closer to my wash pack station. So the stuff that's going to be a little bit longer season, sweet potatoes, corn, those sorts of things are kind of they're on the outskirts, and that way they can have a cover crop. They can have only 1 or 2 crops, whereas my stuff that I do 4, sometimes even 5 crops in a bed in a single year, that's really close to where I'm managing. And for anyone who doesn't know, there's occultation is like a black opaque silage tarp. Oftentimes, that's where that term comes from. Solar is occultation, just being too occult to cut off from. Solarization is often done with clear plastic. That's where that term comes from, is just amplifying the solar effect. So, and then chop and drop, just to get through the jargon, is to cut a crop down and leave it where you cut it. I just want to make sure to clear up any jargon there. And then Dan, I was kind of hoping we could jump back to you for a minute and talk about, give a general overview of maybe one no-till method, or even just bed setup, or something that you think would be really relevant for people on that, especially on that scale.
Yeah, so we're starting, I give some context here. Our tractor just got stolen a few days ago. So the tractor that we're using for the spreading's a 95 horsepower machine, stolen from our property. And it really got us thinking about not using the thing. And I think it's a good reminder for all of us to think about those things that we're currently using, or the things we really, really want, because everybody else has one, is to ask the question, can we do without? And that's big on our mind in the last little while, just as a thought experiment, and then to put this into practicality. So we have about 65 hogs on the farm right now that are getting ready for slaughter. What we did was we took these into one of our greenhouses. It's 36 feet wide, 150 feet long, so it's a fairly large cold frame. And we had just stripped the vines. We use a trellis system for our tomatoes and cucumbers. We stripped the crop material onto the ground, and there were leftover tomatoes. And it was an absolute jungle in that greenhouse just before we did this, and that stuff's all laying on the ground. And we set up shock wire around the perimeter, and we threw 20 pigs in one of these greenhouses. And we were just absolutely blown away by the amount of work that pigs can do. They chewed all the stems of both the cucumbers, tomatoes, and peppers. And there was really just nothing left within 3-4 days. And I think one thing we learned about with using animals, which is kind of the direction that we want to head, is that there is a time limit for animals on any piece of land. And we know that with grazing, the same is true for pigs on land or chickens on land. And so we had to get them out of there within 4 or 5 days, and there was absolutely nothing left on it. And it was just beautiful, these little footprints everywhere, that we could now even put a cover crop in, probably even at this time of the year, and have it germinate by spring, which is what we're going to do next. We moved them into the next greenhouse, the pepper house, same thing, just beautiful. And now they're looking for more work. So we have crops in our field. Like I said, we have a tough time doing winter kill, even for a crop like celery, for example. Quite often it'll go through the winter, or chard will go through the winter. So we're going to start using these animals. They were going to go for slaughter. I think we're going to have them around for a little longer to deal with some of these tougher to remove crops, so that we don't have to use our flail. So I think pigs, chickens really, really appeal to me, and then probably geese as well. So we get a lot of rain here. Geese can take an incredible amount of cold. They love the wet weather. And I'm thinking, if we did a crop like rye or barley or oats, to use the geese to keep the crop short through the winter, and maybe do some grazing with them. And this is based on what we're observing from nature, because we get the trumpeter swans coming around, we get the Canadian geese coming around, and their immediate place they want to hang out is in the neighbors' grass fields, in their rye fields and barley fields and oats. And so we're like, okay, maybe there's this little signal here for us to get into geese, or maybe ducks, and use them as a way to terminate some of the tougher crops. So we haven't done a lot of work in this area, and I can't really speak to it in depth, but I believe there's huge potential of using animals on farms as a way to help us along to remove crops and but knowing some of the challenges, of course, with fencing and predators, and these are real logistical issues with the pigs, for example. If we get those incessant rains, they'll need cover, so you can't just leave them out on a field like you could, say, in the summertime. So there's, plus they're going to do a lot of damage in our area in the winter, just because we get so much rain.
Yeah, that's great. I think animal integration is a conversation that is boundless. We could talk about animal integration all day. We used sheep on our own farm for a while to mow cover crops, kind of like we were talking about with the geese. And one of the things that does, especially in the spring, if you come over rye, or we'd often do it with Sudan grass in the middle of the summer, is that we'd let them, where a lot of people will mow that crop, we would allow the sheep to do that job. So they would fertilize it, they would mow it, and then we'd take them off and let the sorghum and Sudan grass regrow, and that would add a little bit more. The root systems would die back, and that would create soil organic matter, and they could, later on, once we terminated that, it would be even healthier. So one thing I was thinking right now is we could stop and have Ken do the presentation on the work that they're doing. Ken, are you all lined up, do you think, and ready to go for that?
Yes, I can share my screen here, I think, and I've got all kinds of pictures for Chris DeVries. It's going to take me a few minutes to get her up here. There we are.
There you go.
Okay, so I've been involved with this Living Laboratories initiative, and it's funded by Agriculture Canada, and it's sort of a joint project with the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario. And it's all about finding no-till organic strategies for vegetables. It's the horticulture site. EFAO also has a field crop site. So this one's fairly specific to vegetable crops. So I've been farming here, and I'm actually quite close to Sarah. So the same land acknowledgement applies to my farm, which is quite close by. So I've been farming here, I guess 2022 will be my 43rd year of farming here. So quite a bit of experience with growing organic vegetables. My wife and I ran a CSA for 20 years, and now my daughter has taken over the market garden operation. And just to let people know that might not be familiar with me, this is where we're located down here, where the orange arrow is, just north of Lake Erie, about halfway between Windsor and Niagara Falls, and just south of London. So in the milder part of the province, our soils are mostly sandy loams where we grow vegetables, but we also live up on a moraine, which is about 100 feet taller, and curiously enough, up on the top, it's more of a clay loam soil. So just to give you some idea of the guiding principles for this Living Labs project, I've already mentioned that, we're looking for no-till strategies. We're trying to avoid the use of agriculture plastics. It's a 60-inch bed system. It's mechanized, tractor-based system, and similar to what you might find on a larger market garden, 10 to 50 acres. And on these plots you're looking at, there's been no hand or mechanical weeding during the growing season, because we are looking to see what sort of weed control these no-till techniques can provide for us. This is a 3-year project. It started in 2020. It was a little restricted. Ag Canada was a little disrupted by COVID, and we had some plots of cover crops already in the ground. So we used those. They weren't perfect soils, but it did teach us a lot to apply this past year. And in the 3rd year, 2022, we'll replicate some plots of garlic and potatoes, because they're 2 of the more promising techniques. And they'll be side by side with tilled plots. and provide some more reliable data. And I should emphasize that these yield numbers that you're going to see in this presentation are really preliminary. These were not replicated plots, so just some basic yield information to stir your interest, but don't go out and gamble the family farm, you know, by trying these no-till techniques on 100 acres. So some of the techniques that we tried, we've done some deep compost mulch. We used about 2 inches of spent mushroom compost because it's available locally and relatively inexpensive at $35 a ton. And we put it on tilled soil, winter-killed cover crops, or a rolled cover crop. And we also were planting or transplanting into winter-killed cover crops like sorghum Sudan or sorghum Sudan mixed with sun hemp or pearl millet by itself or pearl millet combined with cowpeas, and then also daikon by itself. And we also used a roller crimper, sometimes for a mixture of rye and hairy vetch, or hairy vetch by itself, or crimson clover by itself. And we used a technique which I think Teo called, you know, cut and drop. We used a flail mower before transplants, but after seeding. Anything you put in the ground, you can flail mow after you plant, which sometimes makes it easier to get your plants, your garlic cloves, or your potato pieces in the ground without so much residue on the ground. And these crops that we flail mowed, some examples were rye and hairy vetch, pearl millet, and cowpeas. Just hang with me here. Advancing, just quit. Dylan, can you advance the slides from there? Probably not.
No, I can't. Sorry, Ken.
Wow. Let's try something else. Aha! Got another little arrow. So here we are. This is an RJ transplanter. It's built locally within an hour of me. You can't get local machinery much better than that. It's a small machinery company. And this is a no-till transplanter they built. It's a carousel transplanter, sort of converted into a no-till transplanter. And here we are planting potatoes April 27th of this year into standing rye and hairy vetch. The trick with getting this machine to plant potatoes was to make the seed pieces pretty small, probably below the optimum size you really want to use. But to get this machine to plant potatoes, transplants, and garlic was just, you know, an extraordinary bonus that it could do all of those crops. And here we are. This is the second planting of potatoes. This was May 14th, so a few weeks later. The rye is quite a bit taller. I think it's at the flag leaf stage, so just about the head out. And then when the potatoes were emerging, you'll see a few plants always emerge a little earlier. That was the stage at which we came in with our flail mower. And this is a heavy duty flail mower that can handle, you know, rye that's 5-6 feet tall. It's actually an orchard flail mower for chopping prunings in an orchard, but it makes a great flail mower for heavy cover crops. So that, you know, those potatoes are hiding in this rye, and we're just mowing right over top of them. And here we are a few weeks later, a nice mulch of rye and vetch on the ground to control the weeds, and the potatoes have emerged up through that mulch. And here we are near harvest time. Still pretty good weed control. You know, there's been a few escapes, but this is pretty acceptable. There's 2 60-inch beds here. These trial beds are about 50 feet long. So these are sort of, you know, micro plots really. This is not, you know, these aren't large fields that you're looking at here. But anyways, the rows of potatoes are 24 inches apart because the row spacing is pretty flexible with no-till. You don't have to come back in with tillage machinery or machines to hill these potatoes. So we could play around with the row spacing a bit. And here we are. This is August 30th, a little early to dig these. You can see the skins aren't really set. We've skinned up a few potatoes digging them at this stage, but it was just before a an on-farm tour. This potato variety is one we selected during the Bada Seed Initiative. We were given about 50 selections that Dwayne Falk had crossed, and we were looking for something with good resistance to potato leafhopper, which just happens to be our main pest problem. And we were, I think, astoundingly lucky to find one with very high resistance, very vigorous variety, and seemed to do very well in these no-till trials as well. So here's the machine. It was just a 3-point hitch potato digger that my daughter owned. We couldn't get the regular straight bar to dig into the ground, so we took it back to Wilsey's, and they gave us what they call carrot blades. It's these pointed pieces that bolt onto the regular bar. We added these hilling discs that cut through the residue at the sides of this digger, and it worked even in this very firm no-till conditions. And just to give you some idea of the yields, this was the early dug plot. So, you know, not many green-shouldered potatoes. So a pretty high yield, pretty typical of what you might get in Ontario and a conventional grower might get in Ontario. And then 3 plots that were dug quite a bit later, September 29th. And these plots were mowed off. We mowed the tops off to try to set the skins, but it may have caused more greening of some of the potatoes at the surface. And one thing we're going to look into in 2022 is different cultivars of potatoes apparently set their tubers at different depths. This particular cultivar may set them too close to the surface and cause this loss of greening, but still a pretty respectable yield for no-till potatoes. So another technique, the roller crimper. So we wanted one that was only 60 inches wide. Not being as clever as Ryan and Isabel, I just bought one, and it's made by the Yetter Corporation that makes a lot of aftermarket stuff for conventional corn and soybean planters. This is made to clamp on the front of a corn planter. It's to roll the cover crop just ahead of planting, but I found it would clamp right onto my loader forks, no modification required, and it actually worked quite well. You can either put some pressure on it with the loader, or you can run your loader in float position and skim over the plot you want to roll. So here we are, just a demonstration. This plot here has been rolled. It's hairy vetch, rolled with that 60-inch wide roller crimper. And now we've just transplanted winter squash into here. This is my wife, Martha, who served as my helper in a lot of these trials. You can see the hairy vetch is flowering, and it terminated very nicely when rolled at that stage. And here we have it. This is part of our squash trials. 2 rows or 2 beds of winter squash, and this is the variety butterscotch. It's a butternut type. It doesn't vine as badly. I was worried about it interfering with my other nearby plots, so we wanted one that was sort of a semi-bush type. But it had a real struggle transplanted into this rye vetch. You can see there's a few plants missing. They took a long time to get established. We gave them a side dress of the organic hen layer pellets, and actually at the west end of these rows from the flag to the end, you can see the plants are a little greener, but believe it or not, when we did a tissue test, there was no significant difference in the nutrition that showed up in the leaves of these plants. Now this over here, which is looking much better, same variety, same day it was transplanted, that's on rolled hairy vetch. So getting rid of the rye really gave these plants a boost. And then we had some other that were planted into a deep compost mulch, and we will take a look at the results here. So into the rolled rye with the hairy vetch, rather low yield. The fruit were sort of small. The hairy vetch, doubled the yield, and the deep compost mulch almost doubled the yield again. So it's fairly impressive results, but remember that deep compost mulch, there's probably 100 tons of compost per acre at $35 a ton. That's $3,500. That's a pretty expensive application, but it does give you nutrients, weed control, and moisture retention in a dry year. This certainly was not a dry year for us. Now looking at another very successful no-till technique with garlic was planting into winter-killed millet or sorghum Sudan grass. And this is just about the stage at which we would mow this sort of mid-season. It is a full season cover crop, so you're going to have to devote a full year to growing these warm season crops. I think there were 4 plots here. One of them was pure sorghum Sudan grass. The next one was sorghum Sudan grass plus sun hemp, which the sun hemp didn't really seem to compete well with the sorghum Sudan grass. I think this was pure millet, and then a pearl millet. And then this was pearl millet with cowpeas, and here's a cowpea at the edge, but I don't think my seeding rate was high enough to produce a significant amount of cowpeas in that mixture. But anyways, by fall, this is probably early October, our usual garlic planting time. This was a plot of sorghum Sudan grass. I actually made the mistake of flail mowing it off, produced way too much residue on the ground. And even with this no-till planter, we had trouble with it plugging. There's even a row cleaner ahead of this big coulter. There's a shank here for some subsurface tillage and double disc openers ahead of the shoe. We did get it planted, but it was a challenge. And here are some of the plots the next April. So quite a bit of residue on the ground from the millet or sorghum Sudan grass. We were able to put 4 rows in a 60-inch bed there were 2 units on that toolbar. We set them 24 inches apart, go one way and then come back the other direction to get 4 rows, 12 inches apart. When I drive straight, you can see here they got a little close together. You can see here some other plots. This is early spring that we've applied actually 2 different kinds of deep compost mulch. This is the spent mushroom compost. This is a turkey litter compost plus woody wood chips, I call them, because it's actually chipped slab wood from a local sawmill, and it's very high carbon and did not work very well. It's a little too coarse as well. And we'll look at this were the plots of garlic just before harvest. You know, some weeds in there, but actually it was pretty weed free through the critical period. So some pretty respectable yields. You know, this is a better soil. It's been managed for vegetables for quite a number of years. This is a relatively new plot, lower yield, a little heavier soil, maybe not as well drained, but 11,000 pounds per acre of garlic that were pretty reasonable in size is very respectable for a no-till strategy. And we learned a little bit about having too much residue on the ground. So this fall, planting next year's garlic into standing cover crops. So the tractor's actually starting down a plot of sorghum Sudan grass that's standing. This is millet and cowpeas, and another plot of millet and cowpeas, which we planted that same day. This was very heavy residue and much better weed control. I always find with pure sorghum Sudan grass plots, there's always weeds that are going to seed and in the understory of that sorghum Sudan grass. So the challenges, the DCM, that's my short form for deep compost mulch. It's expensive. Sometimes you'll have weed problems. We buy it from a dealer. He brings in this spent mushroom compost, puts it in a big stockpile in his farm. And when he scoops it up to truck it to me, he sometimes grabs a little soil, introduces some weeds. And then when it's dumped at our place, the same problem. When I scoop it up to spread it, it may introduce a few more weed seeds. And then if they germinate, they usually go wild because of all the nutrients that's in that deep compost mulch. So that can be a bit of a problem. But often the weeds were reasonable. And if you're waiting for a green cover to get to the right stage to terminate, it often makes your subsequent planting pretty late. We experienced that with using oats and peas, planted in quite early in the spring, but still the planting date was pretty late for the transplants we were putting in. And the soil in these no-till plots gets very firm. And it requires pretty aggressive, heavy machines to get the seed or the transplants into the soil. That transplanter I'm using is quite heavy, and you need a pretty big tractor to actually lift it. And then when you're dealing with planting into living covers, that soil is bound together by roots of the cover crop, but it's hard to close that planting trench either of a no-till planter or a no-till transplanter. And some vegetable crops, like that squash you saw, I think find it very difficult to explore that soil for nutrients and water without the prior tillage to loosen that soil. In a no-till soil, certainly if it's just, its first year of no-till, that soil becomes quite firm. And the cover crop must produce enough biomass to control the weeds. And then you've got the challenge of finding a machine that can plant into that much mulch. And you really have to be a good manager, because now you got to grow a cover crop, do a good job, as well as the cash crop, which is going to be planted into it. And there is a trade-off. If you have a biomass cover crop, which breaks down too quickly and doesn't provide you with season-long weed control, sure, it releases its nutrients, but you've lost your weed control. And on the other hand, a cover crop like winter rye is not very long-lasting, but of course does not release the nutrients tied up in that biomass. And just to go through some of the machinery, because this is such a machinery intensive business with large scale no-till. This is what we used for spreading deep compost mulch. This spreader is made in Pennsylvania, I believe, by an Amish company. This one has usually equipped with a big spinner spreader on the back for broadcasting compost. We took that off, and there's a baffle at the back so that it drops at just the width of the spreader. And one of the reasons we chose this spreader, these wheels can be turned around and made to match the 60-inch bed system. And then it's PTO, so by varying the speed of the table chain and the speed that I drive, we can put on pretty much any thickness we want. And we have this is a home-built no-till drill that just happens to fit the beds. I actually built it before we got into these trials, but it's handy that that fits these beds, so I can use it for planting cover crops, or in this case, I was actually using it to plant either spinach or peas into some no-till plots. This tank we can use for liquid amendments. Sometimes we just fill it with water to add extra weight, and you can see there's some plates on here to add extra weight. It takes a lot of weight to add enough weight to each of those openers to get the trench opened up in these, in all this residue plus pretty firm soil conditions. I built this using these openers. They're double disc openers on a parallelogram arrangement with an adjustable down pressure, and they came from a crust buster drill, no-till drill, tractor drill. It's not very common here. You'd have to go probably to the Midwest to find one. And here it is at the back end. It has press wheels which close that trench and give you good seed to soil contact. And just a word about the tractor. This is a big tractor, I consider, on a small farm, 75 horsepower, it's front wheel drive, front weights, because it has to balance that big no-till transplanter. And it has a creeper gear, which is very handy for transplanting. This tractor will go so slow that I can get off and take a video while it's moving. I mean, you can hardly see it moving. That's been sort of handy. And we set up a no-till seeder. This is just a conventional sort of no-till planter, John Deere. It's just 2 rows to fit our beds. It was a vacuum planter, so we put a shop vac up here. It's run by an inverter and an extra tractor, a battery on the tractor platform. It has a variable down pressure arrangement here. You can change the down pressure very easily. We filled up the toolbar with concrete to give it extra weight, and it has these no-till ripple coulters in front of the double disc openers. And here it is working in rolled rye. These regular press wheels, there's not that much pressure on them. They didn't really do a very good job of closing the trench. So we tried these, what are called crumbler wheels. These are made out of like 5/8 thick steel, quite a bit heavier, and these points tend to push the firm soil back around the seed and work quite a bit better. And here we are, we've actually got 4 beds of sweet corn that we've seeded. This here is rolled, I believe it was crimson clover, although it might have been vetch. It looks like there's some purple flowers in there. So we ran this no-till planter through there, planting sweet corn. This was a tilled bed of crimson clover. This was deep compost mulch on top of a rolled cover crop. And this was deep compost mulch, which was then tilled into the soil. And we didn't track yields on here. This is looking from the other end of those beds. This is the tilled deep compost mulch. Believe it or not, the deep compost mulch on top of untilled soil looks a little healthier, a little taller. This is the tilled crimson clover and the no-till rows, 2 rows of no-tilled into the hairy vetch over here. They were okay, but they didn't have the stand. There was a lot of spots where the corn didn't germinate. But an interesting look. Seeding sweet corn seems always a little iffy for us. Often doesn't work very well. This is the electric fence to keep the raccoons out of the trial. And just to look at this no-till transplanter as it came to the farm, we actually had to modify these shanks. We turned them around so they would suck in. These are made so they'll scrape over the top of bedrock in the Kentucky mountains where they use these for planting no-till tobacco. Here we are turned around. And this is just to do a little bit subsurface tillage, but if anything sneaks under this big coulter, it's going to wrap around and plug that, and that certainly happened to us. And these double disc openers have been added up in front of the shoe, and then this shoe here is where the seed, the cloves, or the potato seed, or the transplant comes down, and then it's geared to push them out and plant them at the right distance. We had to put a little flap on the back of here because the garlic would come flying down this chute and just bounce out any old time, whereas the flap held it in there until the blue finger pushed it out at the right spacing. And when we did that, it actually worked pretty well. Just a shot. Here we have added row cleaners to sweep a bit of the residue to the side so this coulter could cut through the remaining residue and it didn't hang up on a shank. And we changed, these are the regular press wheels that are for tilled soil. We took those off and made a bracket so we could add a little extra weight because we were having trouble closing the trench around this transplanted sweet corn. This was actually in 2020. This is rolled oats and peas. This is like the 27th of June, pretty late. And we actually welded some little nubs on here to try to push that soil closed around the trench because that was quite the challenge. And these are some paste tomatoes, plum regal, so they can resist late blight being planted outside. And they were transplanted into rolled rye and vetch. And you can see some missing plants, real struggle for these plants to survive. But actually they came through the season and produced quite a heavy crop. We didn't harvest these, but you can see by the picture that there was a pretty heavy crop of plum regal there. And just another trial we did this year, pearl millet and cowpeas here. We flail mowed it off. This was for late broccoli. Here we are, we finished transplanting the broccoli. You can see the plants here. That's a lot of residue to deal with. And this was quite a bit later in the fall, but it wasn't very successful. The heads were small because we were a little bit late planting this. I think it was the first week of September. We should have been 2, maybe 3 weeks earlier. But it looks like it could be successful because even the surviving millet will winter kill once it gets cold, whereas the broccoli can resist quite a bit of cold weather. That's it. Thank you.
That was great, Ken. That's so much information in there, and I really appreciate you detailing that equipment. And I'm curious what, we're going to talk a little bit about challenges today, and I'm curious, when it comes to the greening, Ken, is the thing that you're more likely to change with that is the variety, and as opposed to some other approach to, I don't know, one of the thoughts that came to mind was maybe like hybridizing a little bit and having like a light compost mulch on top of that to, suppress that greening effect. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that if we can get it to work, changing varieties to where they set their tubers deeper might be better. And also we might reinvestigate, because the early dug ones didn't have the problem. So it might have to do with mowing off the tops. The tops were still quite green when we mowed them off. So they may have been shading those tubers on the surface. Yeah, there's probably a few different avenues to help alleviate that problem.
And Teo, I want to kind of pass that question to you about things that have been challenges for you, and maybe things that you're doing to or maybe questions you have or ideas you have for addressing those challenges.
Yes, well, for me, the main challenge is going to be long-term fertility, because I think when you're working, and Ken was saying, and there's a question in the chat regarding this, when you're transitioning from tilled soil to no-till, and you don't have access to massive amounts of compost or organic matter, there's the mechanical air in the soil will go down, and the biology will be increasing slowly. And when the two lines are crossing, there's a point where your vegetable garden will be producing less, and the soil will feel heavy, and if it's like not working. So for me, it's a challenge, and I'm wondering maybe if after 2 or 3 years there's some difference that you're seeing, Ken, on your trials. For me, my strategy is to make sure that the soil is supported by plants when I'm transitioning, and not by vegetables, because vegetables don't have the good root system. So what I'm doing is I'm making sure there's no compaction. So I'm using a subsoiler when I'm preparing new plots. And after that, I'll be adding organic matter if I have some leaves that I'll be putting, that I will be tilling in the soil, so that fungi will be like gluing the soil. And after that, I'm crossing my fingers, because there's this transition, and I'm not sure what's the least effort we can put in this transition when we don't have access to big amounts of organic matter. Is it clear, or?
Well, I should say one thing about my plots. These are not continuous no-till plots.
Yeah.
I must say I'm quite baffled to figure out a system of continuous no-till with vegetables, because it's a big challenge, at least for me, to figure out at the scale I'm trying to imitate.
Okay, so yeah, the challenge, yeah. Well, for me, I think if we want to make a good transition, we need to take care of weeds and let the fertility grow without losing vegetable yields. So that's like the main focus for me. And for me, I think the simplest and cheapest way is actually planting perennial pasture. So I did this on some fields that I'm preparing for maybe 2 or 3 or 4 years in advance, so that I don't have to make the transition between till soil and no-till and doing vegetable production. So I'll be leaving the clover and grasses do their work, earthworm to come back, fungi and everything. And after that, I'll be killing the pasture with a silage tarp while planting summer squash, or a really long, not summer squash, winter squash that will be growing all season. So this way I'm killing the pasture, preserving the fertility and the biology, and after that there's it's more about conserving, maybe adding mulches, maybe seeding cover crops, and keeping this biology on the long term. So this is the way I'm looking at it for now.
Yeah, that's great. I was going to see Dan just kind of pass the question to you about challenges, but also maybe you have some comments on some of the things that Ken did, and Ken and Teo have talked about as well.
Yeah, really fascinating. I think the first thing that I would remark on is that, Ken, when you applied a deep mulch, I think it was the squash, the butternut squash or buttercup squash that you had there, you noticed significant increase in results, and it looked like the increased production actually far outweighed the benefit or doing a cost analysis. It looked like it actually paid off significantly. And we've been noticing that as well. So it is costing a lot for us to apply these large amounts of compost, but the results are staggering as well. We're getting just incredible returns off that. That's the first thing I'd like to just comment on. And then next to that is, having said that, applying these copious amounts of compost year after year just to mitigate weeds just doesn't seem like a long-term sustainable solution. In the valley here, we do have a lot of mushroom farms and the wood chips, and we have incredible access, and it's fairly cheap. But it's just not going to work if all the farmers around here were to switch to no-till and use some of these methods. So we have to explore different options. And one thing that we're doing is I'm working with Andrew from Terra Flora Organics. He's a compost expert, worked alongside some of Elaine Ingham's, some of the people that she's trained. And what we're trying to do now is develop fungally dominant compost and vermicompost to see if we can reduce our applications of compost to the land and do it in a more refined way, and treat certain areas of the farm with different types of indigenous organisms, and introduce some microbiology to deal with some of our anaerobic conditions in the heavy clay that we're working with. Actually take it to the next level of a little more science-y type thing. Before we were just putting compost on the land. We weren't even analyzing what types of compost this was, other than that it had to be organic. So we're, if you want to develop fungally dominant compost, you have a 2-year, 18 months at the least of being able to do that and get these workers in the soil introduced to the land. So those are just some of the challenges going forward, is actually just getting everybody on the farm up to speed on the soil food web and how we can increase soil fertility without these massive amounts of compost being introduced. Now, and then the last comment that I'll say is that we are repeatedly planting vegetables into our land. So some of our areas we've been doing no-till now for about 7 years. We've been doing vegetables throughout, an assortment of different types of vegetables in here. We don't use a tiller at all. We did experiment with a power harrow last year. I was very disappointed with the results. I think the disturbance that we cause, especially because we use a lot of wood chips, and the destruction of the fungal networks that are created within a heavy wood chip soil, was so detrimental. And I just, I don't want to be a purist, because I know that it's unavoidable for some people in some areas to not use tillage equipment. And I don't want to come across as, absolutely no till whatsoever. That's not my point. My point is, I've noticed that in disturbed soil, we're introducing a lot of new weeds. We're tying up nitrogen because, you're tilling some of the wood down lower, even with a really light tillage method. And yeah, so I just cannot go back there. But the trade-off here is weeding. So for us, just to give you an idea, on 25 acres, we're spending approximately $250,000 on labor. Much of that is devoted to weeding. So we weed through the entire farm every single week and try to maintain 100% weed-free. It's a bit of an experiment, but the idea is that if we can completely exhaust the farm of all weeds, we should be good to go thereafter. So all pathways, all periphery, all boundaries, up against the barn, along the greenhouses, zero weeds whatsoever. And but it's taking a toll, and I don't know if I'll be able to keep this up much longer. The message I'm getting is I'm farming too much.
One thing
oh, go ahead, Ken, if you want to
add. Last year in 2020, we actually, the deep compost mulch mixture we used was 3/4 wood chips, and it was some wood chips off our own farm. So they were at the tops of some poplar trees that we had removed. So it was real more like a Romeo wood chip. And then 1/4 of the spent mushroom compost, and that actually worked pretty much as well. I just ran out of that source and went with what I call the woody wood chips, which didn't work so well. And I would agree with you about the tillage. It's very difficult once you've applied that deep compost mulch, especially if you're just going with 2 inches. Any tillage at all tends to work up soil, and then you have a weed problem. We do have what I call a rapid regeneration trial, which I don't have time to go into today, but where we applied 3.5 inches of deep compost mulch, and it was actually the 3/4 wood chips, 1/4 spent mushroom compost that we were using last year, and it was established in the spring of 2020. And what I was amazed was there's still 3.5 inches, if not more, of that compost. We didn't even plant a cover crop. Actually, there was a volunteer cover crop of quackgrass, and it appears to be building soil and not, disappearing. This is quite amazing to me. And we're going to follow this at least for another year, probably more than that. Okay.
That's great. I've got some questions from the chat that we're going to try and get through for the next few minutes, if that's okay with you all. The John Gagnon is wondering about timing with animal manures and veggie beds, and I suppose this question's for you, Dan. He's wondering about timing with animal manures and veggie beds when animals are put to, like, when do you put the animals in to eat old veggie residue? So I think there's probably several different questions there. Kind of maybe you could talk about considerations for that, just in general.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the standard organic approach is that you have to wait 120 days from the last time the animals are on the land up until when the next crop is harvested. Our solution around that, and I alluded to this earlier, that we have a lot of land to work with. And so our thinking is that once the animals come out of an area, we go in with a cover crop, but an easy to kill cover crops like peas or beans or the like, and we'll take them down easily with our fill mower that we've used traditionally, and then we can get a crop in after that. So, and the other thing is, with the use of animals, the right type of animal for the right type of situation, chickens probably are more suited to, say, cleaning up a salad mix bed, whereas pigs might be better suited to deal with some of the root crop, such as carrots and also the tougher material, maybe broccoli or cauliflower, things like that.
Yeah, that's great. Another question comes from Peggy and Eric. As mentioned, one of the key challenges we face with no-till is hard, dense soil. It is so much easier to plant into tilled soil. Does anyone have any thoughts or recommendations on dealing with dense soils and, how you're transitioning that? Anybody want to jump in there? Teo?
Yeah, well, for me, it's true that it's harder to plant. It takes a lot longer because there's mulch on it, organic mulch, and then after that you need to. I'm not planting in any mechanical way, so it's harder to plant. But I think you're gaining a lot more time after you've planted, because since the mulch is in place, there's gonna be a lot less weeding to do. And I prefer to have a long task that I know is gonna take long than to have weeding that's gonna go all over the place and I don't have control on this task. So for me, it's a good trade-off, but it's sure that it's not the same type of soil. But you need to remember that plants, they don't want tilled soil. They've never grown in tilled soil since they're on Earth. They were always in no-tilled soil with a lot of biology. So it's not because when you're planting it's soft, it's gonna be soft later. Tilled soil will be a lot fluffier when you plant, but if you come back 2 or 3 weeks later, they're gonna be even harder than a no-tilled soil that's just starting. So for me, it's a good trade-off, and it's logical with the new agronomy that we're talking about.
Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
Just want to quickly add to that is that we need to have a long-term view as well and a long-term vision for this. And that's why I always encourage people who are getting into farming, if you are going to go the no-till method, start small, keep it manageable, and don't expect to get great results in your first or even your second year, and then expand from there. So if all you can handle doing no-till is quarter of an acre, eighth of an acre, there's no shame in that. I mean, that's great, but don't count on making your living off of that. Next year, you're up to maybe half an acre, 3/4 of an acre, and expand progressively throughout, keeping that main area weed free. And you will notice that soils, like we're on extraordinarily heavy clay here in the valley, and things do loosen up and lighten up. I need to do a lot more cover cropping. I know that, and I want to do things that produce bulk. So we can grow corn here that gets up to 12, 15 feet tall throughout a growing season. And that's the type of material that's the direction that I want to head as well. But things do improve over time. And it's amazing how after 5-6 years of doing no-till and following some of the methods that Ken and Teo have been sharing, you're going to notice incredible results long-term, and you'll be able to dig into really soft, fluffy soil. It's amazing.
Yeah, I concur, and we've had that similar experience. One of the things that may also be an option is they've been, the panel's been talking about deep compost mulches. That is an option to start out on denser soils. You do still want to attack that compaction a little bit of disturbance is, these are plants that recover ecosystems, right? All of our vegetables, that's kind of what they are. So a little bit of disturbance is not going to be the end of the world, and it's going to actually allow those roots to penetrate deeper. So on a small scale, you can use something like a broad fork, but I know Teo had mentioned using a subsoil or something like that, especially in situations where it's just really dense, really compacted, and there's no soil organic matter. Because once your plant roots get through that layer of compost, they're going to run into sludge in a heavy, dense clay situation. So that's where you end up with anaerobic scenarios. But in my experience, that's kind of how we view it, is you may take a couple of years of just light disturbances like that to slowly get those roots in there. And then after that, you can back off. Next question. Let's see. Eliza Salmon. I'm wondering if there have been any trials with deep rooting plants or earthworms to combat soil compaction, especially in combination with no-till methods. Anybody have any thoughts on that? I know generally speaking, earthworms are a great thing to find in your soil. You're doing good things if you're seeing earthworms. Cover crops bring in biology. Biology brings in earthworms. Earthworms eat and consume the microbes and not the stuff, right? That's what earthworms are doing. So if you have good microbial life, they will slowly break through compaction, but it's a very slow process. I know that in really heavily compacted scenarios, if you're just using natural methods, it can take 10 or more years to break through. So a little bit of human intervention in that situation can rapidly speed up that process.
I've used daikon radish. I mean, it's certainly deep rooting. You know, I don't like it as a standalone cover crop for no-till because you have very little residue, very little weed control. We did actually use it in combination with a deep compost mulch and produced a crop of head lettuce, followed by a crop of, spinach, followed by head lettuce. And we had 2 crops out of that plot.
Dan, you had something to add there too?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that what we're trying to introduce in soil is organisms of a higher taxonomic level. In disturbed soil or soil that's very immature, we have a lot more bacteria, and we want to work towards, the nematodes and the fungi, especially. And as we do that, I mean, those are the workers that are going to actually do the breaking up of the hard pan down below. And it's really, really difficult for us to have a hands-off approach and say, well, I want to go in there and I want to soften things up and I want to, of course, living plants is going to help as well, but to allow the microbiology to do that. And Jesse, you already referred to that as, how do we introduce these organisms into the soil so that they can do the work? And we need the lower level ones in order to get the higher level ones. But the higher level ones are really doing the work of actually breaking things up. And by higher level, I don't mean necessarily bigger. I just mean more creatures that come around in more advanced, mature soils.
Yeah, great addition. Matt Jones says, Dan, are you using wood chips in your beds at all? Any concern with nitrogen being tied up? I feel like you were working on a wood chip and chicken manure compost setup. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we use tons of wood chips, and like Ken, mixed with mushroom compost seems to be a really good approach. And then we apply that typically in the wintertime when we get a winter freeze. That's our only opportunity to get in onto the land with heavy equipment. We'll apply it at 1 inch. But if you're not tilling, remember, you're not going to be tying up nitrogen in the lower levels. Sure, maybe on the surface, there's going to be more demand for nitrogen in order to break up the wood chips, but down below, there seems to be no tying up of nitrogen. I'm not sure exactly why that happens, but you definitely don't want to till them in. So just on the surface, 1 inch probably per year in the wintertime is applied to our entire property. But what I would rather do with those wood chips is have them on a pile and age them for 1 to 2 years, and then use a compost extract in order to apply some of the indigenous microorganisms that you're going to be attracting to that pile, and apply that to the land in a foliar form, or in as just something you apply to the soil around living plants.
Yeah, that's great. So, okay, so there's a question in here about irrigation. And I think this is important because a lot of times when you're using, and it's specifically about deep compost mulch, a lot of times when you're using deep compost mulch, it can be a little bit hydrophobic, at least in this first inch or so. And this one comes from Henna. What kind of irrigation system are you using in the deep compost mulch? Does this system require much water? Anybody want to jump in on that one?
Sure, I can talk to it first. So not much water required at all, although our summers are quite dry. When I say not much water, I'm meaning never a deep soak. So what we're doing right throughout the summertime is we're watering probably 3 to 4 times a day, but for at most 1 to 2, maybe up to 5 minutes. So really, really small applications of water, particularly in crops that are water sensitive. And we use water as a cooling agent, but we also use it as a way to germinate crops quickly. But we don't water potatoes at all, and we can get 3-4 months of no rain here.
In my trials, we depend on sprinkler irrigation, but the deep compost mulch, I would say one of the big advantages is that it acts like a mulch and will keep the soil moist underneath. In fact, we've had big problems if you're seeding into the deep compost mulch instead of into the soil or at the boundary between the two. Your germination can be pretty poor, and we're not set up for sort of easy irrigation. It's what I call more of an emergency system. Only if it's really dry will we get out the sprinklers and irrigate.
Yeah, that would have been my addition too, is that the moisture retention below surface is really wonderful, but that right at the surface level, getting things to germinate, carrots, anything really, is it can be difficult. And it also can, like Dan was mentioning, get really hot. And we do something similar where we have sprinklers on a timer here in Kentucky, where we're in 6B. During the summer, we have them on a timer, and we're running them every 45 minutes for about 3 minutes at a time, just to cool everything down, in the 100-degree days and get us through that period. But maybe we have time for one more question. This one from Aslan Organics. Hi, Dan. Curious if you could speak to the resiliency of your soil. I know that you're in Fraser Valley and you guys have just gone through your third atmospheric river, and heavy ground and lots of water isn't typically a good combination. How have your fields performed in the heavy rainfall?
So hi Aslan Organics. I know you guys used to be here in the valley as well. Nice to hear from you. We had 24 inches of rain in the month of November alone, and most of that fell in the second half of November. So we had an extraordinary amount of rain. You're right, heavy soil has issues with that. So we use a Big O drainage system. It's kind of like the weeping tile, or the classic drain tile that people have been applying for many years in this area. We're just a few feet above sea level here. And we drain to our ditches using that system. Now, to enhance that type of drainage, we find that mulching is the best way to do that, because we want the water to be able to permeate through the soil down rather than running off. And we actually have a lot of runoff right now just because that system is not developed in some areas. But I'm curious, and the things I need to learn down the road is how can I apply microbiology at the surface in order to improve drainage down below at the 1, 2, 3 foot level. That's the big thing that I still have yet to discover. And I know earthworms are going to do the work, fungi is going to do the work, but how long is that going to take? And what is the best way to speed up that process? Because we need to get the water off the land fast.
Well, I want to say thank you to all of our panelists. In a second, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, but I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who attended and to our panelists. And thank you for having me moderate this. This has been exceptional. So thank you again, and I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. Thank you, everyone. A great discussion. I was just reminded that if you haven't already, please sign up for EFAO's e-news. You can go to our website to do this, because we will be hosting no-till meetups this winter to continue this type of fabulous and important conversation. We also welcome everyone to join the Wonder platform after this if there are questions that you have for each other. Now that we're over, I am going to just end with our few final slides. We value your feedback, and we would love to hear how what you thought of this session. Dylan's going to launch a poll. If you could answer that, we do look at all of the feedback. If you have any questions or comments beyond that, please email conference@efao.ca, and also look out for the full conference survey that we will send out to you next week. Maybe I have to launch the poll. Launch, there we go. Oh, it was already started, sorry, okay. Stay connected. There is this is the last day of the conference, but we do still have 3 options to engage on the Wonder platform, including now and at lunch and this evening. There's the Carrot Cash Innovation Prize. Please check out those innovations and vote for your favorite, as well as some incredible silent auction items. And the bidding for this ends tomorrow at 3 p.m. So there's lots of time to look that over even after you've watched the conference. And continue to tag EFAO on social media, et cetera, et cetera. We love to see your pictures and hear from you in that way. Jesse, thank you. Dan, Ken, Teo, Isabel, thank you all for being here today. This really engaging conversation on no-till, and we look forward to future conversations on this subject in the future. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, everyone.